In these videos, I've been looking at the polarities that split our society. And I've pointed out that if you examine any of these polarities closely, very often you'll find that underneath it all is a trick or a deceit, something false. And I also suggested that if you actually introduce the trickster into the situation and recognize it, then what was just a frozen battleground, two opposing sides, can turn out into a fertile space where actually movement takes place. Things can evolve and change. So the trickster can be a great healer when you have a split dualistic polarization. But there's another way it can be useful, and that is in humour. Now, humour is actually very much connected to trickster. A typical joke leads you down a story until you get to a punchline where suddenly a different meaning of a word comes out, or a different perspective that you hadn't been looking at it before, and you laugh. And also, if you watch street conjurers when they perform their miracles, when it comes to the effect, people scream, but it isn't so much screaming of terror as screaming of laughter in most cases. It triggers laughter, a trick. So the trickster has got so much to offer. And in very difficult circumstances, it can be a way of facing up to our fears. I know it was said that in the First World War, when people went over the top from their trenches, they were going into machine gun fire and almost certain death. And they used to say that when the German soldiers went over, they would sing hymns. When the French soldiers would go over, they would sing patriotic songs. And when the British soldiers went over, they would shout, "Marmalade!" And that was how they faced up to death. But in a more realistic way, you could say that at the height of the Second World War, when people were under terrible pressure, it was jokes about Hitler and the Nazis. It was songs like Colonel Bogey, and also movies like The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin, that kept people laughing and kept them alive in the face of this great danger. So, humour has got so much to offer. But what the point I want to make is you've got to be careful, because it can also be very dangerous. And to illustrate that, I'm going to invent a story about a person called David who goes to the cinema to see a trendy new film. And it's one of these, it's obviously made for television because it begins, instead of having the title, it goes straight into a pre-title sequence. You go straight into a scene which is clearly a rugby club victory party. Everyone's absolutely sloshed. They're staggering around singing dirty songs. They're all men. And then one of the men grabs a microphone, gets up onto the stage, and he sings a rugby song, an old rugby song. And this is what he sings. "It's only human nature after all to take a little girl behind a wall, to rip off her protection and ram in your erection. It's only human nature after all." Loud cheers and a great sloshing of beer. And someone in the row in front of David walks out. David stays to see the rest of the movie. Then he goes for a coffee afterwards to think it over. And there in the coffee bar, he sees the person who walked out. So he goes over to him and says, "I saw you walked out of that movie. That first scene was pretty bloody awful, wasn't it?" And the man said, "Yes, it was. Absolutely disgusting to suggest that a piece of animalistic, coarse, sexual violence could be praised as human nature. I thought it was terrible. And David says, well, I agree with you, but the trouble is, in walking out, you missed what was actually quite a good movie. I went to it because The Guardian described it as a savage indictment of the hypocrisy of toxic masculinity. And if you'd stayed a bit longer after the titles, the next scene we see the same man who sang that wearing a suit and a tie, standing in a pulpit. He's a lay preacher and he's preaching family values. And the other guy says, yeah, that's all very clever and satirical, but what do you think the effect of presenting a song like that to the public? And David says, well, the effect it had on you as you walked out. The man said, yeah, no, it's not me. Think what it would be like for a vulnerable 17-year-old boy who maybe he's been rejected in love, he's feeling very insecure in his masculinity, and then he goes and sees that. And he sees the person who should be a role model of masculinity, the captain of rugby, singing something like that. Do you think that would be good for him? And what's more, what would it be like for what they call a young girl, a little girl, to be hearing that said? And the answer is that, what are those balloons doing? I don't know. What would it be like for a little girl? And what David says is, well, it's funny you should say that, because my daughter's school friends thought it was hilarious. They said that the final scene where the rugby cheerleaders gang up on the captain of rugby and make a fool of him in public, they said that's one of the funniest things they'd seen in the cinema. So, what do you think of that? And the man says, I don't care. There are some things just too serious you don't make a joke about them. Now that is really slamming the door on the humour. There are some things you just don't make a joke about. I said how Colonel Bogey and jokes about the Nazis and everything were what kept many people going during the war. But if you said those jokes in Germany, it would have been a death sentence. Very strict lines are sometimes put up in dividing humour as to what is acceptable and what is not. And it's partly a defensive thing because people are suspicious of the trickster. They make a devil out of the trickster very often. It's considered, that the devil is considered to be a trickster figure. And this drawing of the line can be very dangerous if you cross it. I remember one of the interviews of Jason Lowe, who does the Magic Me podcast. He's a very good interviewer. And there was an early one I listened to many years ago when he was interviewing a colleague of his who'd been a journalist like he had. And they were talking about how things had changed. And this colleague said, yes, I think it was a podcast or it was a blog. And I made joke about peanut allergies. Said, if your friend has got a peanut allergy, tell him not to be such a wimp. Now that is a classic bit of turn of the century humour. A time when people were so sensitive about, being politically correct, that a stand-up comedian would stand up and say something outrageous like that, and everyone would roar with laughter just for the shock of hearing it said. And then they'd go away, and that would be the end of it. And that featured in the movie, which I like very much, called Analyze This, where it starts with Billy Crystal playing the role of a psychological counsellor. and the man facing him is going on and on about his feelings, and suddenly Billy Crystal leaps up and says, "Don't be such a fucking wimp." And you realise a second later that he didn't actually do that. What you saw was what was going on inside his head, and that was funny. So what that person wrote in his blog was a piece of classic sort of turn of the century stand-up humour. But he said the effect of it, the response to it, was appalling. He got hate mail. He actually got death threats, in the sense of people saying, "I hope you die of some horrible allergy for saying that." And he said that was bad enough. What was even worse was letters he got like this. A woman wrote saying, "You've got every right to say what you think, but if you know what it's like to bring up a baby that's allergic to peanuts, the agony you see him going through, the trouble you have to take to avoid them, and the lack of sympathy you get from some people, you wouldn't say something like that." And he said he felt so terrible. He was so ashamed. I think he wrote a sort of disclaimer afterwards and an apology. It shows that how things can change and what is acceptable as humour can change. Now, that rugby song, I gather that when it was written, it was seen not so much as a thing about little girls, it was seen as a satire on human nature. People saying, "Oh, it's only human nature," and then describing something as terrible as that. It's changed. The whole reaction to it has changed. Now, this is something I myself am quite sensitive to, because through the 70s, 80s to the 90s, I wrote a satirical column, and it was called The Satanist Diary. And in it, I satirised a lot of the things that were going on at the time. There was the satanic panic, and there was the various wars, and there was Reaganism and Thatcherism and things like that. And I created a lot of really ghastly characters. They were satirical, they were over the top awful. But there was this wonderful phrase, "the man I love to hate," because these characters were really all the ones you love to hate. They're so ghastly that people actually liked them as jokes. And people said, "Oh, you must publish that as a collected works." And many, many years passed, and then it was only about 4 years ago or something, I finally published it as a collected work. It's called The Hellgate Chronicles, and it was a ghastly flop. It hardly sold any copies. I actually had returns, and hardly anyone reviewed it. It went down like a lead balloon. Things had changed so much that what was seen as satire in the 80s was now so politically incorrect and unwoke. The book was, at best it was ignored, shall we say. So I'm very much aware of, although I'm an advocate for the trickster and the fun and the laughter and the way it can defuse a situation, the way it can break down the barriers, I also felt I ought to add this to point out that it can also be very dangerous. You're playing with fire, so play carefully.